This lesson, we're going to talk about dynamic segments or dynamic routes. Let's get started. In the previous lessons, we created different pages for our application or different segments and routes by creating these different folders. And we created UIs by putting in layouts and pages inside these segments. We also created some nested segments by nesting folders inside of it. And we learned overall that we create segments using folders and we create UIs using files. So far, we've used the page and the layout file to create some layout that's shared between multiple pages, and the page.jsx to create a unique UI for that specific route or segment we're trying to target. Now, sometimes we don't know the name of the segment ahead of the time. What if we want to create a page or a component that would dynamically fetch data depending on what page or what segment the user is trying to access and then show it? Imagine that we have a segment or a route to go to our blog posts. So we want to render our blog posts. Inside of it, we can have a page.jsx. This is going to be where we render all of our blog posts or a list of all the blog posts that we have. So let's export a page component from this. And here I'm going to say all blog posts. Okay. Now this would be a place for us to show a list of all the posts. How about each individual post? So let's say I have a blog post about learning Next.js. If I want to create that path as a nested path inside of my posts, I'll go ahead and create a folder here called Learn Next.js. And then inside of it, I can put a page.jsx component. I'm going to export a React component from this file. And this is going to be my Learn Next.js 13 blog post. This is an individual blog post. So therefore, if I now go ahead to /learn Next.js, this specific page component is going to be rendered and render my Learn Next.js blog post. Now for this, you might have your data living in a content management system, a CMS, or maybe you're publishing your posts as Markdown in a separate GitHub repository, or maybe you're just creating them inside of your app in a folder, let's say content, and then you want to create your posts inside of this content. And then here from this React server component, you want to fetch this specific posts by calling a function, let's say get post by slug. This is going to scream at us because we need to turn this into an async component. Now, don't worry about this async await syntax here. As you remember, all the components, pages, and layouts inside the app folder are React Server components. You can turn React Server components, which are basically functions, into async functions. Therefore, you can just fetch your data inside of it. We're going to have a specific lesson talking about server components later on. But for now, let's say we want to fetch the content of this specific post, and then we're going to pass in a slug here. Our slug is learn Next.js. We're going to fetch it with such a function, and maybe down here you want to show the content of this specific post. We're going to fill this in. We don't have this function, so let me just comment this out for now. You get the idea. So if you're fetching this post by slug, this slug is learn Next.js. This is what we're passing right now, and we're fetching it from somewhere. This can be local inside your content folder, it can be inside a database, a CMS, or inside another Git repository. Wherever it's coming from, you're going to then fetch it and then show it down here. Now, if you want to create another blog post, you'd have to go down to your app, to your posts segment, and then create another nested segment. Maybe this time learn React. You should learn React before Next.js. But anyways, you put in the page.jsx inside of it, and then you would have to just basically copy what you had over here to there. But this time when you're fetching this get post by slug, you just say, instead of Next.js, I'm going to just fetch this specific blog post from wherever it's coming. As you can see here, these are stuff that we cannot know in advance. If we are having just a couple of posts, we can do it this way. But instead of recreating this page component or function, just basically doing the same thing, it's fetching some data and then rendering the content down there. we can create a dynamic route or a dynamic segment. So therefore we can show all of these pages, all of these blog posts just with one page component. We're going to dynamically look at the specific segment or route or blog post that the user is trying to access. We're going to then get that parameter, fetch it from our database, from our local content, or from our CMS, and then render it here. So that's the idea of a dynamic segment. Now, how would you go about creating a dynamic segment? Well, the way to create it is that you can wrap your folder name or your segment name with a square brackets. So I'm going to name it slug, as in a blog post slug, and inside of it, just like any other route segment, to make it accessible, we'd have to go ahead and create a page.jsx. And literally what we want to do there is what we were doing in our first blog post, which is we're going to get a function. We're going to create this function together. This is going to fetch our content from our source, and then we're going to pass in a dynamic value this time for this slug, because we just don't want to go this specific hard-coded slug. We want to actually dynamically change the slug based on the blog post that the user is trying to access, and then render the content over here. So with that out of the way, let me just actually delete these folders. We no longer would need these folders. Also the learn React. Now that we want to render this specific segment dynamically, we have to have a way to actually get access to this specific dynamic segment. So if I go to my app, inside of our posts, we now have this dynamic slug segment and a page component that's going to represent or render that specific blog post the user is trying to access. But how do we know what slug is actually trying to be accessed? Well, this specific dynamic segment or parameter is going to be sent to your page as a params object. So let's just go ahead and console log this params object over here. Now this is a React server component, so you would see the logs inside your terminal. And as you can see here, I have this params object down here that has a slug property on it that's pointing to learn Next.js slug. So this is the path that the user is trying to access. Now it is called slug because I named my dynamic segment slug. Had I named it ID, it would have just been ID. This is going to look at what you actually named this dynamic segment and create this params object according to that. Now, if I change this now to, let's say, learn React, it's going to change down here to say learn React. So this is going to read this dynamic segment from the URL that the user is trying to access, and it's going to pass that down to your page component. Okay, so that's the first step. So out of this, let's actually go ahead and get this slug out, because we want to know what specific slug the user is trying to access. And the next step is to actually create this get post by slug. So we have a slug that the user is trying to access. Now let's create that slug. For this, I'm going to create some markdown files inside of my project, inside this content folder. So I'm going to create a learn next.js.mdx. So MDX is a superset of Markdown. It allows you to actually use React components inside of your Markdown files. If you're not familiar with Markdown or MDX, I do have a video on the YouTube channel. So off this platform, you have to go to the YouTube channel and learn how you can use MDX in Next.js 13. We're going to implement it here together. But if you are not familiar with what MDX is or Markdown is, maybe you can watch that video or cross-reference that video to kind of get familiar with. Now, let me just post some content over here so you don't watch me typing. There we go. Now, as you can see here, I have some front matter. This is a convention to include some information or metadata about the actual content of the page. For example, here I have the title over here and the author. Can add a date, image. You can use this front matter as metadata used for this page. You can create metadata tags. For social sharing, you can also use this data when you're trying to render a list of all of your blog posts. We're going to see together. And then down here, I have a simple markdown files. We're going to add more to it. We're going to add React components to it too. But for now, let's just start by a simple markdown file. Now, to be able to read MDX inside of our Next.js application, we're going to actually use a package called Next.mdx remote. Again, in that video that I mentioned on the YouTube channel, I also do talk about this Next.mdx remote or how to set it up, but we're going to basically do it here together. So the first thing that you need to do is to actually add this package to your project. So I'm going to stop the dev server, run pm add Next.mdx remote. I'm going to restart the dev server. Just actually close this off. Now, what we want to do here inside of our page component is to create this getPostBySlog function that actually goes ahead and reads the content of this specific markdown file that we created using the Next.mdx remote package. That is just basically a package to compile MDX or markdown and then turn them into something that React can actually render. Okay, so we're going to create a lib folder over here. This is where I'm going to put my functions. I'm going to create a posts maybe file inside of here. So let's just go ahead and create this function that we're trying to access inside of our page component. I'm going to name this getPostBySlog. The idea is to pass a slug to this function, and for this function to read the content of that specific slug inside of our content, parse the MDX or turn it into something React can actually render, and then send it back to our page. So for this, I'm going to just create a pointer to our root directory. Let me just close this off so you can see. All I'm doing is that I'm saying my root directory is whatever current working directory is, and then the content folder. This is where I'm trying to put my content in. Yours might be different. And what we're going to do here is to read the content of this file. So we're going to first replace the MDX at the end of the file. So if you pass in a file name, let's say learn next.js.mdx, we're going to just extract the MDX out. That's the real slug. We're going to be left with learn next.js, which is what we're trying to kind of access inside of our application. And then we're going to join that with our root directory. For this, we're going to actually need the fs module. So what we're doing is to create this file path, and reading with the fs module, we're reading the content of this file. Now we need to pass this content to MDX remote, which is the package we just installed together. So we're going to get a function from that package. Now, with the use of this function, we can just parse the MDX and the front matter out of the content of our file. So we're going to pass this as a source, and we're going to also pass an option to also parse front matter. This is indicating that our blog post actually does contain front matter, and we want to separately parse that and get access to that content. We're going to pass that to compile MDX, which we got out of this package. This is going to give us a content that we can render inside of our page, and some front matter that actually is an object that contains this specific key value pairs. Okay, so then from this file, all we're going to do is to return the content and the front matter that was returned from here. Now going back to our page, if I just comment this back in, I'm going to remove this hard-coded parameter for now, and I'm going to get this function by trying to importing it from inside of our lib folder. Let's just get rid of that React, we don't need it. And then I'm going to pass in this slug to this component. This is going to give me back the content that I need and also my front matter. I'm going to then use this main tag down here to render my content. Let me just save this and see if we can see the content of our blog post. I have to go to posts. Inside of our posts, we're not seeing a list for now. We're going to fetch that in a bit. But if I go to learn next.js, this is exactly the blog post that I do have inside of my content. So this is mapping to this slug over here. And as you can see here, I can see the content of my blog post over here. This is a markdown file. As I can see here, here's a list. I have item 1, 2, 3, and this is working. So we're able to fetch the content of our markdown file server side inside of our React server component using a dynamic segment, which is this slug, to dynamically read that specific parameter or slug that the user is trying to access, pass it to this function to read the content of our blog posts, find that specific one that has this slug, parse the markdown as something that we can just pass into our React component to be rendered. We also get some front matter over here. So instead of having this learn Next.js, let's actually go ahead and say access a front matter. This should have a title, and then here we should also have an author. So I'm going to say front matter dot author. So if I save this, I should still see that same thing, learn Next.js, and the author name. Now this time it's not hard coded, it's actually dynamically coming from that specific blog post. Now if we wanted to actually style them, because right now this is an h tag but it doesn't look like an h tag. If I open up the console, you can see the markdown is actually correctly parsed into the correct HTML tag. So this is an h1, and for this unordered list that you can see in the markdown, we are ordering this unordered list over here, but they're not actually styled. Now something that you can see here on my main tag is this pros class. This is a Tailwind class that you can put in for styling such markdown files that's coming from a source that you don't control, or you can just dynamically style them. But you need to install a plugin in your Tailwind. So if you go to Tailwind and actually search for typography, you're going to see Tailwind comes with this typography package that you can install. So let me just copy this here. And what this allows you to do is that it allows you to actually pass in this pros class to a tag, which then goes ahead and styles everything inside of that parent that's classed pros automatically, so you don't have to go in and style all them one by one. Because literally here, when you're rendering this content, right now here down here, you don't have access to the specific elements that was passed in here. Now I'm going to show you how you can customize the elements that are parsed when you're using the Next.mdx remote package. So when you're reading the content of your markdown file or your MDX file, you can actually decide how they're turned into different HTML elements. We're going to see that shortly. But for now, as an easy way to just dive into this content and style it properly, what we're going to do is to stop our dev server, and then we're going to have to install this dependency, which is Tailwind CSS typography, and then we have to also add it to our Tailwind config. As you can see over here, we have to add it to our plugins. So we're going to go to our project, to our Tailwind, and we're going to add this plugin to our Tailwind. And now if I restart the dev server, let's actually close all of these pages and go back. We should be able to see our blog post now, this time styled. Now as you can see here, now the h1 tag and our unordered list is automatically styled. Now another way to customize what's returned from this MDX compiler, as I mentioned, is to pass in some custom components to it. So if we go to our lib, this is where we created this function. For this compiler, we can actually pass in some components. So this is going to be an object which is going to map every HTML element, let's say like h1, to a specific component that you can pass to it. So let's actually create this over here as an example. I'm going to create this outside of here. Now let's say what I want to do anytime that I am parsing an h1 tag inside of our MDX content, what I want to do is I want to return an h1 and I want to set a different text size or color for it. Now I can go ahead and pass this component down to the compiler. So therefore, when it is compiling my code or my content, it is going to actually look at this custom component and then return this specific component or tag for when it's encountering an h1 or a heading tag. Now, if I refresh the page, you see this is not going to take effect because right now Tailwind is not actually reading the content of this lib file. So for this to work, you would have to go to your Tailwind. You'd have to actually tell it to look inside of your lib folder too. So I'm going to just add in the lib folder. This is going to also allow Tailwind to parse the content of my lib. And as you can see here, now my h1 tag turned green, which is using this custom component that I provided to my compiler when we are compiling or parsing our MDX content. Now, similar to this, you can create more custom components that you can pass into your markdown files as well. So let's say inside of our content, I want to actually add in a newsletter. So let's say I want to create a newsletter component. I want to pass in a newsletter, because the benefit of using MDX compared to Markdown is that MDX allows you to actually add in components. So let's say I have a newsletter component. I want to pass it in here. So let's go ahead and create that component inside of my component folder. Maybe I can create a newsletter component. Let me just copy the code here so you don't watch me actually typing. Okay, so this is a component. It's just a section and a div that says subscribe to my newsletter, right? Now we want to create or use this custom component inside of our markdown files. Now, when we have a custom component that MDX compiler doesn't know or doesn't understand what it is by default, because it does understand HTML tags or compiles this markdown to HTML tags, but when you pass in a custom component, it has no knowledge of it. So therefore, you need to pass in that specific component over here. So I'm going to say, if you came across a newsletter component, I want you to go ahead and render this newsletter component from inside my app directory. So let me close this off. So this is the newsletter component we're getting from our components folder, and I'm passing in a reference to this component's object that I'm passing into my compiler. Okay, so if I now go ahead and save this, I have this newsletter over here, and then now if I refresh the page, we should be able to see this specific newsletter component. Now, this can be any component that you can share between different blog posts that you have. It can be a header, it can be a footer, it can be a little subscription to your newsletter, a form for users to actually subscribe. But the idea is that you can render React components inside your markdown files, and that's how you would just tell your compiler to parse this specific components. Now, one last thing I wanted to show you here as a bonus is if you have code snippets inside of your markdown file. For example, let me just copy paste some content over here. So let's say we have this code snippet we actually want to include inside of our blog post. So if I now refresh the page, now as you can see here, this is going to be added as a code block, and it is automatically actually being styled by our Tailwind as well. So this is a pre-tag, and inside of it there is a code, and it does also come in with this specific language. Now, if you want to take it a step further and actually enable syntax highlighting for your code snippets, the same way that you would have probably seen on my own site, we're going to do that with a plugin called Rehype Pretty Plugins. So when we are actually compiling our MDX code, in these options, we can pass in some Rehype plugins. This is going to help us for syntax highlighting. So to install this, you can just come down the page all the way where you can install the Rehype Pretty Code and the Shiki. This is going to create different themes for your syntax highlighting. So let me just stop the dev server. I'm going to pm add these two packages, and I'm going to show you how you can add these Rehype plugins to your MDX compiler. So let me just go back and import this specific Rehype Pretty Code that we got from this plugin. We're going to add also some options for this making our code pretty or syntax highlighting. There are different themes that you can use out of this Shiki package. If you go up top, this Shiki comes in with different themes that you can use. Here I'm just using the One Dark Pro. So similar to what VS Code is using. Nevertheless, so if you have that plugin, we also have these options, and all you need to do is to actually pass these options to your MDX compiler. So down here where we are passing in options, what I'm going to do is to actually also pass in these MDX options, including this Rehype plugin. I'm going to pass in the plugin that we installed, got from the package, and also pass in the specific themes that we want to use for our syntax highlighting. Now, if I go ahead and restart the dev server now, going back to our page. And if we refresh, we should be able to see the syntax highlighting kicking in automatically. So now, as easy as that, you can see we are rendering the content of our MDX or Markdown files locally from our project. So we're fetching them from here. Again, this can live inside a remote repository, in a database, in a CMS. Doesn't matter. You're just fetching that content inside your React Server component. You're parsing it if it's MDX. In this case, it is. We're adding some options to style them. We're passing in some custom components to be rendered. We're using custom components inside of our markdowns. And we also added syntax highlighting for our code snippets. Now, one last thing to do is to actually go back to our all posts page and render a list of all the blog posts that we have. Because currently right now, we're actually just rendering this all blog posts text. So if I go to the posts, and to this page component, this is where we want to render a list of all of our blog posts and then enable the user to click on them to then go to that individual blog post. So let's go ahead and create a function here. Let's say we want to get all of our posts and we're going to await. Let's call this get all posts. So this is a function we're going to create together. Let's also turn this to an async function. This is again a React Server component where we can just fetch all of our posts. And once we have all of our posts, let's just render them down there. I'm just going to copy some code that I created. Now all we're doing here is to get all of our posts, map over them, and for each one we're creating a list element and a link that allows us or the user to actually go to that individual post. And the way we're linking to that specific page is to go to our posts segment, and then we are just using string literals. We're plugging in this specific posts log to that route using the link component. We are going to then navigate to that dynamic segment. In that dynamic segment, the component or the page we just created prior to this is going to pick up on this log on that dynamic segment, is going to fetch that specific blog post, parse it, and show it to the user. Now let's just go ahead and create this all posts function together. I'm going to go inside the lib and posts. Here we're going to export an async function. We're going to name it get all posts. And what we're going to do here is to read the content of our root directory. And root directory here is going to actually go ahead and go to that content folder. So let me just close this off. By root directory, I don't mean the project root directory. It's going to go inside that content. So it's going to read all the file names there. And we're going to create a posts array, and we're going to actually map over this files. So const file of files. We're going to, for each one, get the post by actually awaiting get post by slug. This is the function we just created up top. We're going to pass in that file name that we got by reading the content of that directory to this function. This function, again, if you remember, is going to extract a DMDX out of the file name, and it's going to find that specific slug for us. Once we found that slug, we're going to get the posts array and push that specific post to it. Once we're done with all of our files, maybe we can return this posts. Now going back to our page component, let's just actually import this from our library. This is going to give us all of the posts. And with that, as you can see here, I have the content of the page shown, and I have one post over here which shows the title by reading its front matter that's returned from our backend function, and the author name, and then there's a link which if I click on it, it doesn't work because it's cannot read the undefined. So obviously we didn't provide this as slug. Going back to our functions, when we are actually getting this post by slug, I'm only returning the content and the front matter. Let's actually also return the slug and pointing this to the real slug. So when we are fetching this or calling this function for every file inside of our directory, we're actually also returning this as slug. This is what we are going to then use inside of this post. So each post has a slug. It also has a front matter. This is what we're returning. So basically for each post, this object is returned. There is a content. In this case, we don't want the content, we just want the front matter because we want a list based on the titles, and we do need this slug so that we can point the user to the correct slug. So now going back to the page, if I go back to my all posts segment, now I can see this. Let's just refresh it one more time. Now if I click on it, it's going to go to posts/learn Next.js, because we actually did return this slug also as part of this object that we're returning by reading the content of each file. And once we do that, the content of that page is now rendered. Now you can easily go ahead and create different contents by providing different files here. So let's say I'm going to say learn react.mdx over here. Inside of it, I can put in a title. Again, our metadata over here, or front matter. The title will be learn react, and let's say the author is again me, and then here we can include learn react. So we're going to say 1, and now if I go back to my posts, we should be able to see that second post also kicking in. And if I now click on that one, it's going to take me to this post where you can see I'm rendering the content of this markdown file I just created, and also the front matter. So going back to this dynamic segment one more time, as you can see here, I have this header section. It's just going to read the front matter, here the title and the author. Now we're going to learn about metadata API later on in the lessons. We can use this front matter data to actually populate specific metadata tags for these dynamic segments later on. But for now, we're just rendering a header component here that summarizes what this specific post is about. And then we're actually rendering the content, which is the markdown file, inside of this main tag, which is styled with Tailwind CSS. Now with that out of the way, there's one last thing that I want to mention, and that's kind of cross-referencing the way dynamic routes work in Next.js 13 and Next.js 12. Now in Next.js 12, inside the pages router, whenever we had dynamic segments, we would fetch the data inside our getStaticProps. That was a Next.js specific function you could run that will fetch your data from your backend, from your CMS. Similar to what we did here inside of our React components, there you should have used a separate function. But then for your dynamic routes, you should have also exported another function called getStaticPaths. That would tell Next.js what paths actually to go ahead and statically generate at build time. Now inside of our dynamic segment here in Next.js 13, we actually never indicated to Next.js what are the possible values of this parameter or this specific slug. Right now, all of our dynamic routes or segments are generated on demand at request time, because Next.js has no way of understanding what specific content or blog posts we do have. But there is a way to tell Next.js what specific paths or dynamic segments we want to statically generate. If we go to documentation, this function inside Next.js 13 is called getStaticProps. So instead of getStaticPaths, which is the equivalent of getStaticProps in Next.js 12, we can just export this function from our page to say, hey, these are the slugs that I want you to go ahead and create statically at build time. If I'm not returning any slug here, sure, go ahead, run this page component and still dynamically generate that at request time. But if you want an optimization or actually make your pages faster by generating them statically at build time, you can actually go ahead and create all of these pages at build time. So we can just export an async function called getStaticProps. From inside of it, we're going to get all of our posts by calling our getAllPosts function we created together. And then we're going to map over these posts. And for each post, what we want to return is an object containing a slug which points to that specific post slug. Now by exporting this function, Next.js can go ahead and fetch our posts at build time and generate all of these slugs statically, so we can benefit from the performance boost rather than generating these pages on demand at request time. Now keep in mind that if you do not export this function, as we didn't in the beginning, or if the user is trying to access a slug that you did not return from this function, Next.js is still going to go ahead and run this page component and fetch that specific blog post anyway. This is just to optimize your pages or your application by statically building the pages at build time if you know the slug or if you have the content ahead of the time. Now, one more thing that I want to mention expanding on our dynamic segments is catch-all segments and optional catch-all segments. Now, if you have more than one dynamic segment, similar to what you can see here, so instead of just one segment or route segment, you have a couple of them, you can actually create catch-all segments that match all of these segments that come after your base path. And the way that you will create it is to just pass in this 3 dots or ellipses inside of your square brackets. So at your folder name, you would have brackets and then this ellipsis inside of it. And what this does is that not only it's going to catch that first dynamic segment, but also it is going to catch every other segment that comes after it. And the difference is the params object that's now sent to your page component. It does include that same slug key, but now the slug is an array because it can also contain different values. So it is going to be an array of values compared to our case, as you can see over here, which was just a specific string we passed into this specific function. Now, if I go ahead and actually turn this slug that we have to a catch-all route, so you can see firsthand. So I'm going to rename that to include that ellipsis there. Now with that, our slug is going to be an array, so we need to access the first parameter inside of our slug. And if I now save this and go back to our component, you can see we have to also obviously update the generate static params, because this function now also expects an array for the slug. So we're going to wrap this inside of an array. And with that, we should be able to see the content of our page because we're still extracting that first element out of this slug. If I just go ahead and actually log this params object, so we can see firsthand how it looks down here in the terminal, we can see now our slug is an array that contains that learn React slug. Now, if I go ahead and actually after this, maybe go part, I don't know, 1. As you can see down here, our slug not only includes that first segment, but it also includes this second segment. And this route is still called by this same segment that we have created over here, by this same page component. Even though that's technically another route, it is still rendered inside of this same page. Now, this is useful if we want to, for example, provide any categories. Let's say our posts have different categories for 2023 and then our posts, or maybe you wanted to change them based on the topic. So you can use that. Or if, for example, you're in an e-commerce, you want to have, different categories for your products, men versus women, and then shared t-shirts, so forth and whatnot. You could just create one specific dynamic segment that catches all of them together. Now, the optional catch-all segment, or the only difference between the two, is that the optional catch-all segment not only is going to match every other dynamic segment that comes after your base path, but it is actually going to catch or match the base path as well. So if there is no dynamic segment pass, it's still going to match. So in our case, that will be our /posts. So even if there is nothing after, there is no slug or dynamic segment after, it is still going to match the /post. So you can have the logic so that if there is no slug inside of your params, you're going to render the all posts page. So that means somebody just accessed the /posts. And if now you do have a slug for when somebody goes to /posts and then learn Next.js, you get that slug. You know the first element is going to be your blog slug post, and then the rest is going to be however you want to manage these different categories of that logic of these different segments that you put in there. You're going to then parse that array and decide and determine what content you want to return back to your users. And with that, we've covered dynamic routes in Next.js 13. If you want to access the source code for what we're building throughout these lessons, I've created a repo called Next.js course on my GitHub account. You can go there, you see different branches mapping to specific lessons. So for each lesson, there's going to be a branch with that same name. You can go from the starting point if you're creating this with me, and you can also see the finished version of the code once we're done with every lesson. For example, here we have the starting point, the pages and layouts, the navigating between pages. This is specific lesson is dynamic routes, but you get the idea. There's going to be a branch for each of the lessons throughout the course. That's a wrap for this lesson, folks. We covered dynamic routes in Next.js 13. We also talked about catch-all segments and optional catch-all segments. We rendered MDX content using the Next MDX remote package. We also got familiar with fetching data inside our React server components. We used other APIs from the app router, which we're going to build on top of in the future lessons. Now in the next lesson, we're going to talk about route groups, which is another feature from the app router. See you in the next lesson. Bye-bye.